On the morning of September 16, 2025, the New York Times reported the tragic news that Robert Redford had passed away.
Robert Redford was more than a movie star. He was a symbol of an entire era, the kind of actor whose presence defined generations of cinema. His life seemed smooth from the outside, yet the man who once stood at the very center of Hollywood spent his final days far removed from the bright lights, living a life that could not have been further from his glory years. And when the end finally arrived, it came in a way no one could have imagined. Robert's bumpy rise to fame. Robert Redford is remembered today as one of the most legendary figures Hollywood has ever produced. An actor, a director, and a cultural icon whose influence stretched far beyond the screen. His face defined an era of American cinema. His voice became a symbol of thoughtful storytelling, and his name is forever tied to both box office glory and the independent film movement. Yet behind the glamour of his career and the awards that later followed was a personal life that was anything but smooth. His path was full of illness, grief, rebellion, and mistakes that could have ended his story before it ever began. Robert Redford was born on August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica, California, and on the surface there was nothing particularly glamorous about his childhood. His family lived an ordinary working-class life, moving around Southern California and sometimes spending time in the South, where he would seek out solace later in life. Life took its first sharp turn when Redford was only 11 years old. At a time when parents across America lived in fear of the polio epidemic, young Robert contracted the illness. His case was considered mild, but it was serious enough to leave him bedridden for 2 weeks. For Robert, the fear was real, especially because children of his generation knew what it meant to see others confined to iron lungs, and the thought that his own condition might worsen hung heavily over him. Redford later recalled how those days changed him. Illness stripped away a sense of invincibility, and it forced him to see early on that health and life itself could be taken in an instant. If that brush with mortality left a mark, the tragedy that came 7 years later carved something deeper. When Redford was 18, his mother passed away suddenly from complications after childbirth. She had given birth to twin girls, and the delivery led to a fatal hemorrhage. Sadly, both infants died as well. For Robert, it was a devastating loss. He had been close to his mother, and he later spoke about how her death created a void that could never truly be filled. Losing her at such a young age, right on the cusp of adulthood, left him with both regret and a lingering sense of unfinished love. It also pushed him further into a restless search for belonging and purpose, something that would shape his choices in the years to come. During his teenage years, Redford channeled some of that restlessness into rebellion. Growing up in Van Nuys, he joined a local street gang known as the Barons. It was dangerous, reckless, and at times nearly deadly. He was pressured into proving his courage in ways that tested the limits of safety, including one incident where he was forced to jump off a rooftop. He survived, but it could have easily gone the other way. At another point, he found himself in real legal trouble when he was arrested after driving a car that, unbeknownst to him, contained stolen jewelry in the trunk. These brushes with the law were not the actions of a hardened criminal, but of a young man spiraling, a teenager carrying grief and trying to find identity in all the wrong places. In high school, Redford developed a love for baseball, and his skill on the field earned him a scholarship to the University of Colorado. It was a golden ticket, a chance to build a future. But with opportunity came temptation. College life offered freedom, and Robert embraced it too much. He partied, drank heavily, and neglected his studies. Unfortunately, his scholarship slipped through his fingers, and before long, so did his place at the university. For many young men, that could have been the end of the story, a wasted chance, a life that might have been. But Redford didn't stop there. Instead, he turned his back on the path that had failed him and set out to see the world. He traveled across Europe, spending time in Paris, Spain, and Italy, living as a painter and absorbing the art and culture around him. Those years abroad gave him a broadened perspective, a love for creativity, and a realization that his life had to be about more than survival or rebellion. He studied painting seriously, believing at one point that visual art might become his profession. But the experience also unlocked a different kind of performance inside him that would eventually lead him toward acting. When he returned to America, Robert redirected his energy into the stage. In the early 1960s, he began picking up roles in theater and television, slowly building a name for himself. His first major success came on Broadway in Neil Simon's romantic comedy Barefoot in the Park in 1963. Playing the charming but nervous young husband, Redford found his voice as a performer and caught the attention of critics and audiences alike. The role would later become a hit film in 1967, but even on stage, it was enough to prove he had the kind of spark that could carry a story. Hollywood immediately took notice of him, but his true breakthrough came in 1969 with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Starring alongside Paul Newman, Redford embodied the role of the Sundance Kid with a mixture of charisma, danger, and humor. The film was a phenomenon, grossing over $100 million and cementing his place as one of the leading men of his generation. Practically overnight, Robert Redford went from a promising stage actor to one of the most recognizable stars in the world. Yet unlike many actors who might have been satisfied with fame alone, Redford's ambitions stretched further. In 1980, he directed his first feature film, Ordinary People, a psychological family drama that stunned everyone. The film went on to win 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Redford. He had proven that he wasn't just a movie star, he was a storyteller in full command of his craft. Not long after, in 1981, Redford founded the Sundance Institute in Utah, named after his most famous role, and what began as a workshop for emerging filmmakers grew into the Sundance Film Festival, the most important platform for independent cinema in America. It became the launching pad for directors like Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, and countless others, and it cemented Redford's legacy as an actor, director, and builder of opportunities for others. But as his career reached new heights, the challenges of his personal life were only just beginning. Robert faced battles with heartbreak, tragedy, and the kind of private pain that even fame and success could never erase. The battles behind the fame. Robert Redford looked like the perfect example of charm, grace, and golden success. However, most fans never saw the battles happening behind that polished surface. Fame gave him the platform to shine, but it could never shield him from grief. In 1959, Redford became a father for the first time when he and his then-wife, Lola Van Wagenen, welcomed a baby boy named Scott. The joy of parenthood filled their home, and for a short while, it seemed as though the turbulence of Redford's younger years had settled into something stable and hopeful. But just 10 weeks after his birth, tragedy struck. Baby Scott died suddenly of what doctors identified as sudden infant death syndrome, a condition that has claimed countless infants and left families without answers. One moment the Redfords were planning their child's future, and the next they were planning his funeral. The loss devastated Robert, who later admitted that the grief of losing his son never truly left him. 2 decades later, another battle with illness arrived, this time stretching over years instead of weeks. Robert's second son, James, was diagnosed with a rare and life-threatening liver disease. From his teenage years onward, James lived with the knowledge that his body was fighting against him, and his health struggles defined much of his adulthood. He underwent not 1 but 2 liver transplants, each a grueling ordeal for the entire family. Redford was by his side throughout, refusing to step back even as his own career demanded attention. The bond between father and son deepened during those long years of hospital visits, treatments, and moments of uncertainty. James later became a filmmaker himself, using his experiences to tell stories that mattered, often about health and the environment. But in 2020, after decades of battling illness, James lost his fight. He died at 58 from bile duct cancer, and once again Robert found himself burying a child. The grief was heavy, compounded by the memories of losing Scott so many years earlier. It was the kind of loss no amount of fame or fortune could soften. These tragedies alone would have been enough to crush many people, but Redford's life also carried brushes with death of his own. In the early 1950s, long before Hollywood fame found him, he nearly lost his life while drag racing. Driving at close to 90 miles per hour, his car crashed. The impact was violent, and he was lucky to walk away alive. That crash shook him to his core and served as a constant reminder of how quickly thrill-seeking could end in disaster. It wasn't the last time he pushed himself to the edge, but it definitely planted a seed of caution that never left him entirely. But for Redford, the battles weren't always physical. In fact, many of them were internal. When his mother died during his teenage years, the grief pushed him into a spiral that left him vulnerable and lost. Depression followed him closely, and he coped the only way he knew how at the time, through alcohol. He drank heavily during those years, and the habit grew worse during his time at the University of Colorado. Nights spent drinking blurred into mornings where responsibilities slipped further away. The same lack of control that cost him his baseball scholarship and his place at the university also left him feeling directionless. In fact, he later admitted that he had been too young, too angry, and too broken to handle the weight of his emotions in healthier ways. Being expelled forced him to confront that downward spiral, and although he eventually redirected himself, the years of heavy drinking greatly impacted his life. Aside from the struggles with alcohol, the battles within his family also shaped who he became as a man. James's health issues meant that the Redfords spent decades living under the shadow of hospitals, operations, and the constant worry of relapse. Watching his son endure pain and uncertainty tested Robert's resilience, but it also drew out his capacity for patience and empathy. When people saw Robert Redford on the big screen, they saw the Sundance Kid, the charming rogue, and the man who always seemed to find the right words at the right time. But what they couldn't see were the long nights of worry, the grief of losing children, the trauma of nearly dying in a speeding car, and the years of battling depression and alcohol as a way to dull the pain of loss. These battles behind the fame made him a more complicated man than his career showed. These struggles also influenced the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he struggled in his relationships. Robert's complicated love life. Robert Redford's life on screen was often painted as flawless, a blend of rugged masculinity and quiet sensitivity that seemed to make him the perfect leading man. Audiences saw him as the kind of figure who could win the girl, save the day, and walk away untouched by the chaos around him. Yet, in reality, his love life was marked by private heartbreaks, whispered rumors, and the difficulty of balancing intimacy with a career that placed him constantly in the public eye. The first major chapter of Redford's romantic life began in the late 1950s, before he was even a recognizable name. He met Lola Van Wagenen, a woman whose world was far removed from film sets and industry politics. Lola was intelligent and thoughtful, and would later become a historian and activist, carving out her own career in education and social causes. Their relationship was rooted in a sense of stability, and in 1958, at just 21 years old, Robert married her in Las Vegas. At that point in his life, he was still searching for his direction, and the partnership gave him grounding. Their marriage lasted for 27 years, a remarkable length of time in an environment where many marriages collapse under the weight of fame. Together, they had 4 children: Shauna, James, Amy, and their firstborn Scott, who tragically died as an infant. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, as his career soared with films that defined a generation, Lola largely avoided the spotlight, dedicating herself to raising their children and later pursuing her academic work. However, unfortunately, the marriage ended quietly in 1985, without scandal or public disputes, a private conclusion to a union that had endured through the most transformative years of his life. After the marriage ended, Redford's romantic life became less predictable and more difficult to track, not because of public scandals, but because of how carefully he guarded his privacy. Yet even with his efforts to remain discreet, rumors constantly surrounded him. In 1987, while directing and producing the Milagro Beanfield War, he was linked to Brazilian actress Sônia Braga. Although the reports never developed into a confirmed relationship, the speculation never ended, reflecting the fascination the media had with Redford's personal world. By 1990, he was said to be involved with Swedish actress Lena Olin, around the time they worked on the film Havana, That same period also brought a steadier and longer-lasting relationship with Cathy O'Rear, a costume designer with whom he was involved for much of the early 1990s. These relationships showed that while Redford was not someone who sought attention for his private life, he continued to draw interest simply because of who he was. But the most enduring and final chapter of his romantic story began with Sibylle Zaggers, a German multimedia artist. Redford and Zaggers met in the 1990s, and their bond grew over many years before they formalized their relationship. Unlike many of the women connected to Redford in the past, Zaggers was not part of Hollywood. Instead, her work centered on art and environmental themes, which aligned closely with Redford's own deep commitment to activism and conservation. After almost 2 decades together, they tied the knot in 2009 in Hamburg, Germany, and settled into a shared life in Utah. Together, they combined their passions, working side by side on projects that connected art, film, and environmental advocacy. Their relationship endured until the end of his life, marking a rare example of lasting companionship for a man whose career had so often kept him in the shifting orbit of fame. But what complicated Redford's love life further were the blurred lines between his professional roles and the relationships he developed with his co-stars. Throughout his career, he was paired with some of the most admired women in Hollywood, and their chemistry on screen often sparked speculation. During the making of The Way We Were in 1973, Barbra Streisand later admitted that she was deeply infatuated with him. The authenticity of their connection on screen made the romance in the film unforgettable, yet Redford kept strict boundaries, to the point of reportedly wearing protective layers during intimate scenes to ensure the performance never crossed into reality. Another long-standing collaborator was Jane Fonda, with whom Redford appeared in 5 films over the course of their careers. Years later, Fonda openly confessed that she had been in love with him during their work together, though she never revealed those feelings at the time. Redford himself maintained that he had no idea she felt that way, an admission that surprised many, given the ease and warmth of their on-screen partnerships. To viewers, their performances always seemed infused with genuine affection, which only made Fonda's later confession all the more striking. And then there was Meryl Streep, his co-star in Out of Africa, who many years later called Redford her favorite on-screen kiss and admitted to having a significant crush on him during filming. The film had already been celebrated as a romantic masterpiece, and her comments added another layer of fascination, suggesting that the depth of their performances was drawn from something more than professional skill. Redford constantly inspired admiration that often crossed into genuine attraction, even though he rarely allowed himself to reciprocate or blur the lines between work and personal life. He was a man who could embody romance so convincingly on screen that even his colleagues felt it linger once the cameras stopped, yet he chose to keep his real attachments private and carefully separated from the roles he played. But just as his romances raised admiration, his later choices and outspoken views would create friction, placing him at the center of controversies that revealed another side of his story. The controversial side of Robert? For much of his career, Robert Redford was known for his conviction, stubbornness, and refusal to compromise on issues he believed mattered. As a matter of fact, his most enduring public stance came from his commitment to politics and the environment. At a time when many actors preferred to avoid taking political sides, Redford was outspoken about his progressive views, aligning himself with liberal causes and environmental protection long before such advocacy became common in Hollywood. His political voice grew louder during the 2000s and reached a new intensity during Donald Trump's presidency. He shocked the world when he publicly accused Trump of lacking a moral compass, warning that his administration's policies threatened the core values of American democracy. More than once, Redford used his platform to highlight the dangers of environmental deregulation, arguing that decades of progress in conservation could be undone in a single presidential term. To him, the environment was not just a political talking point but a lifelong mission, reflected in his work with the Sundance Institute and his personal investments in land preservation in Utah. These outspoken views earned him praise from progressives, but also criticism from conservatives who dismissed him as another Hollywood figure out of touch with ordinary Americans. Redford's willingness to stand his ground was not limited to politics. Within Hollywood, he often found himself clashing with collaborators, most famously during the making of All the President's Men in 1976. The film, based on the Watergate scandal, was one of Redford's most ambitious projects and one he helped shepherd from book to screen. Yet behind the camera, tensions ran high. William Goldman, the celebrated screenwriter brought in to adapt the story, found himself at odds with Redford over creative control. Goldman later revealed that working with Redford was difficult because the actor wanted to shape not only his own performance but also the structure of the film itself. Redford, for his part, believed that Goldman's script did not fully capture the scope and urgency of the story. Their disputes became so intense that Goldman eventually distanced himself from the final production. And although the film went on to critical and commercial success, the conflict left behind a lasting impression of Redford as a perfectionist who could be demanding to the point of alienating even the most respected talents in the industry. That determination to control his image also surfaced in other projects, sometimes in ways that generated friction with studios and co-stars. During the early 1990s, Redford nearly walked away from Indecent Proposal, a film that paired him with Demi Moore and Woody Harrelson. Redford reportedly disliked elements of the script and was hesitant about how the moral dimensions of the story would reflect on his character, a billionaire who offers a married couple $1 million for one night with the wife. The premise alone was provocative, and Redford wanted assurances that his role would not come across as sleazy or predatory. For weeks, he debated whether to abandon the project altogether, and his reluctance caused delays and frustration for the studio. Ultimately, he stayed on, but the uncertainty showed how selective he had become with his choices, and how difficult it could be for Hollywood executives to navigate his concerns. A similar situation had unfolded years earlier with The Great Gatsby in 1974. Though the project promised prestige and commercial appeal, Redford openly disagreed with casting decisions and felt the production was mishandled. His discomfort grew so great that when the film premiered, he refused to attend, sending a clear message that he did not want to be associated with what he considered a compromised work. The absence of its leading man at the premiere fueled speculation about his discontent, and though Redford rarely addressed the issue publicly, those who worked on the film understood that he had been unhappy from the beginning. Such clashes were not limited to specific projects. Throughout his career, Redford resisted the machinery of Hollywood itself. He disliked the superficiality of the industry, often rejecting the endless promotion and networking that others considered essential to success. He was known to skip studio meetings altogether, or to arrive hours late when his presence was unavoidable, testing the patience of executives who counted on his star power to drive films forward. To Redford, the business side of Hollywood was an intrusion on the art, and he made little effort to hide his disdain for the transactional nature of the industry. This attitude earned him a reputation as both principled and difficult, admired by those who valued integrity, yet frustrating to those tasked with managing budgets, schedules, and publicity campaigns. And as his career wound down and his health began to decline, these same qualities shaped the final chapter of his life. But even in his final days, the tragedies and convictions that marked his journey never fully released their grip, setting the stage for an ending that came quietly but carried the weight of a lifetime of battles, triumphs, and losses. Robert Redford's final days. By the time Robert Redford reached his 80s, his life had already stretched far beyond what most people could dream of. And yet the time inevitably came when he began to step away from the world that had defined him for more than half a century. In 2018, he made the announcement that fans had long dreaded but also respected. He declared that The Old Man and the Gun would be his final acting role. It was a fitting choice, a quiet, reflective film about a career criminal who could never quite let go of the thrill of one last job, mirroring the way Redford himself was taking a final bow in front of the camera. Speaking about his decision, he admitted that it felt like the right moment to move toward retirement, to spend more time with his wife and his family, and to live the kind of life he had always cherished in private, away from the noise of the industry. Even after that announcement, there was still one final, unexpected appearance left in him. In 2019, he returned to the screen in Avengers Endgame, reprising his earlier role as Alexander Pierce. The cameo was brief, but it carried enormous weight because Redford himself saw it as the symbolic closing of his acting career. He told the Russo brothers, who directed the film, that it would be his very last day of acting, a farewell to the craft that had carried him from Broadway to some of the most celebrated films in history. His career as a serious actor ended with that quiet moment inside one of the biggest films of all time, tying his legacy to both classic cinema and the modern era of blockbusters. Away from the camera, Redford's final years were spent in the place that meant the most to him, his Sundance home in Utah. He had lived there for decades, finding comfort in the mountains, the forests, and the isolation that allowed him to step back from fame and simply exist as Robert, not as a star. In 2020, he sold his horse ranch, choosing instead to focus on his property in Provo Canyon, where he and his wife, Sybil, built a life centered on art, conservation, and family. On September 16, 2025, the world was hit with devastating news. At the age of 89, Robert Redford passed away peacefully at his home in Sundance, Utah. The news broke hearts around the world and marked the end of an era in American cinema. Tributes poured in from colleagues, friends, and admirers, each acknowledging not just the actor and director, but the man who had stood so firmly for art, integrity, and the natural world. For his family, it was the loss of a husband, father, and grandfather. But for audiences, it was the farewell to a figure who had shaped the way they saw storytelling on screen. Over the course of his career, Robert Redford appeared in more than 70 acting roles, directed 9 films, and earned nearly every honor the industry could bestow, including Oscars, Golden Globes, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Yet his impact went far beyond his personal achievements. By founding the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, he gave generations of independent filmmakers a platform to bring their visions to life. Robert Redford will be remembered not only in the stories he told himself, but also in the countless stories he made possible for others. What's your favorite Robert Redford movie? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.